Okay, so let's unpack this. If you want to find the biggest financial backers of America's modern progressive and democratic socialist movements, your first instinct might be to look in union halls.
Right. Or maybe working class neighborhoods, where people are actively organizing for better wages.
Exactly. You'd probably picture these grassroots campaigns funded by like $10 donations from people just trying to make rent. But according to the massive stack of sources we are unpacking for you today, that picture is fundamentally outdated.
It really is.
Right.
The data tells a completely different story.
Yeah, if you want to find the structural funding for the modern anti-capitalist movement in the United States today, you actually need to look in the trust funds and the inheritance portfolios of America's wealthiest capitalist immigrant families.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive, I know.
Uh,
But we are looking at a sociological shift that really, it challenges a lot of our basic assumptions about class and politics.
it totally flips them upside down.
Yeah. The materials show a scenario where the direct beneficiaries of massive global capitalist success stories are utilizing their inherited influence,
And their inherited capital.
right, their capital, to systematically dismantle the very market systems that created their family's privilege in the first place.
And that is the core mission of our deep dive today. We are mapping out for you exactly how massive wealth, specifically from highly affluent Middle Eastern and South Asian immigrant families, is flowing directly into modern Marxist-leaning political operations.
And we're going to explore the specific semantic wordplay these organizations use to, avoid federal prosecution.
Yes, the legal loopholes are fascinating. Plus, we're going to look at the ground-level consequences. We'll see how this specific ideological marriage is triggering major constitutional, economic, and security flashpoints in municipalities all across the country.
Because, the theory is one thing, right?
Yeah.
But the actual application is actively reshaping municipal laws. It's altering public school policies, testing the boundaries of constitutional rights in real time.
But before we go any further, I need to pause and establish some really important ground rules for you, our listener.
Very important, yeah.
The source materials we're breaking down today deal with highly politically charged actions. They cover controversial legislation, municipal battles, and rhetoric that spans the extreme left wing and the extreme right wing of American politics. We, as your hosts, are absolutely not taking sides.
Not at all. We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints presented in these documents. We're not validating the political strategies, and we are definitely not passing judgment on any of the communities, the legislators, or the organizations we'll be discussing.
Right. Our only job here is to act as your impartial, objective guides. We are just here to convey the factual content, explain the historical context, and, break down the ideas contained within the provided sources so that you can understand the underlying mechanics of what is actually happening.
Just laying out the map for you.
Exactly. So, with that framework established, where do we actually begin? Because trying to merge elite capitalism, democratic socialism, and orthodox religious identity,
It's a lot.
it feels like trying to assemble a puzzle where the pieces come from three completely different boxes.
It really does. And to understand the modern map, we actually have to look backward. The sources suggest we begin in the early 20th century to look at the first serious attempts to synthesize Orthodox religion with Marxist theory.
Which, from a purely theoretical standpoint, is wild, because you're entirely correct. Those concepts are designed to be mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at foundational Marxist theory, it's built on something called dialectical materialism,
The core of the philosophy, yeah.
which, for anyone who hasn't brushed up on their political philosophy lately, is essentially the idea that human history and societal structures are entirely driven by physical economic struggles over resources. It explicitly rejects the spiritual or the divine.
Completely rejects it.
Marx famously called religion the opiate of the masses, like a tool used by the wealthy ruling class to drug the working class into accepting their poverty in exchange for a promised reward in heaven. So how does anyone even begin to synthesize atheistic materialism with devout Orthodox religious tradition?
Well, historically, political pragmatism has a way of overriding philosophical purity.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, and the sources direct us to a very specific historical figure to understand this. A guy named Mirsaid Sultan Galiev.
Okay, who was he?
He was active in the early 20th century during the Russian Revolution. Now, he was a committed Bolshevik, but he explicitly advocated for something he called National Islamic Communism.
A Bolshevik advocating for Islamic communism. I mean, how did he justify that to a revolutionary movement that was actively burning down churches and mosques?
He used a very specific strategic lens regarding imperialism. So Sultan Ghaliev looked at the Muslim populations within the Russian Empire and across the colonized world, and he argued that these traditional societies had been structurally exploited by Western and Russian imperialism for centuries.
Okay.
Therefore, he theorized that the entire colonized society, regardless of whether someone was a local merchant or a poor farmer, was effectively the proletariat on the global stage.
Oh, I see. And the Western imperial powers were the bourgeoisie.
Exactly. He scaled it up.
So he took the traditional Marxist idea of the factory worker fighting the factory owner, and he applied it to entire nations. The colonized nation is the worker, the colonizing empire is the owner.
That's it. And crucially, he argued that the deep religious cohesion of these colonized societies was their strongest unifying asset.
Interesting.
He basically told the Soviet leadership, look, if you try to export atheism to these populations, you're going to face massive resistance. Instead, he proposed that religious cohesion shouldn't be destroyed, it should be weaponized to achieve Marxist collectivism.
Right. You don't tell a devout population to abandon their faith for the revolution. You tell them their faith is the actual engine of the revolution against the West.
That is the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
You co-opt the pre-existing social infrastructure. Now, Sultan Ghaliev was eventually purged by the Soviet leadership because his ideas were deemed too threatening to central Moscow control.
Sure. They didn't like competition.
Right. But his underlying theory, what historians often refer to as Muslim Marxism, it provided a lasting blueprint.
Do we see that blueprint showing up in other historical movements before we get to modern America?
Oh, absolutely. We see it repeatedly throughout the 20th century. A prime example in the sources is the Mujahedin-e-Khalq, or the MEK, operating in Iran during the mid to late 20th century.
Okay, what were they doing?
They were a militant organization that attempted to directly fuse Shia Islamic theology with Marxist dialectical materialism.
But how does that actually work in practice? Like on the ground?
Well, they interpreted the core stories of Shia Islam, specifically the historical oppression of marginalized figures within the religion, through the lens of Marxist class struggle.
Wow.
Yeah, they argued that true Islam was inherently classless and anti-exploitative. And they used this synthesis to recruit religious youth into a Marxist revolutionary framework aimed at overthrowing the U.S.-backed Shah.
So they took orthodox religious tenets and mapped them directly onto a textbook Marxist revolutionary structure.
Exactly. And we also see a broader version of this in mainstream Arab socialist movements. If you look at Ba'athism, which became the dominant political ideology in Syria and Iraq,
right,
or Nasserism in Egypt, under Gamal Abdel Nasser.
For the listener, what did those systems actually entail on a day-to-day basis?
They borrowed heavily from the Soviet model of central economic planning. We're talking about state control of major industries, massive land redistribution programs, highly centralized government authority.
They wanted the socialist economic playbook.
Yes, but the leaders of these movements knew they were governing deeply religious populations. They knew they couldn't just import Soviet state atheism without triggering a massive revolt.
So they blended the socialist economics with a carefully curated layer of religious and cultural identity.
Right. They framed their socialist policies as being perfectly in alignment with traditional values, essentially arguing that state control of resources was just, a modern implementation of religious charity and communal responsibility.
And that brings us to the bridge connecting this history to what is happening right now in the United States. We're looking at organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA.
Right.
Now, the DSA on a national level is doubly secular. Their broader platform is focused on labor rights, universal health care, wealth redistribution, and dismantling the capitalist system. So how does that secular framework interact with the religious synthesis we just talked about?
The sources show a distinct ideological echo of that historical blueprint within the modern DSA. The organization actually hosts an active religious socialism working group. Yeah. And within that structure, there is a dedicated DSA Muslim caucus.
A religious socialism working group within a secular Marxist-leaning organization? I mean, how do they internally justify that partnership?
They utilize a progressive anti-imperialist framework. They identify specific foundational Islamic mandates and argue that those mandates naturally align with the goals of democratic socialism. And the most prominent example they point to is zakat.
Okay, let's define zakat for the listener to make sure we understand the mechanics of this comparison.
Sure. So zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is an obligatory form of almsgiving and social charity.
But it's more structured than just passing a hat, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just dropping a few dollars in a donation box. It's a formalized mechanism where individuals who meet a certain threshold of wealth are required to give a specific percentage, typically 2.5% of their accumulated wealth.
Accumulated wealth, not just income.
Right, not just income. And that goes to the poor and to support the broader community.
So it's essentially a religiously mandated wealth tax designed to ensure social welfare.
Yes. And the organizers within the DSA take that religious duty and connect it directly to secular socialist policy goals. They argue that if you believe in the religious mandate of zakat, you should naturally support political policies like universal health care, aggressive wealth redistribution, and, the dismantling of a capitalist system that they argue inherently hoards wealth.
Wow. So they are using class struggle rhetoric as a translation device.
Exactly.
They can look at secular Marxists and say, look, these religious communities share our ultimate goal of massive wealth redistribution. And then they can look at religious traditionalists and say, your mandate for social charity can only be truly realized if we enact our socialist political platform.
It unites two incredibly disparate groups, secular progressives and religious traditionalists, against a common enemy, which is a free market capitalist system.
Which leads us to the most glaring paradox in this entire stack of sources. If this ideological alliance is organizing a movement against capitalism, who is actually writing the checks to fund it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Literally, yeah. Because the historical cliche of a socialist movement involves impoverished factory workers organizing a strike fund.
But the demographic reality detailed in our sources is entirely different. The primary drivers and financiers of this modern American progressive socialist movement are overwhelmingly the wealthy second and third generation children of highly affluent Muslim immigrant families.
We're talking serious money.
Yes. We are looking at demographics spanning South Asian, Arab, and Turkish heritages.
Let's break down the sociology of this because the timeline here is fascinating. You have this initial wave of professional immigrants arriving in the United States, mostly in the late 20th century, like the 1980s and 90s.
And these were often highly educated, highly skilled professionals. The materials specifically highlight groups like Pakistani tech executives, Syrian and Egyptian physicians, and Turkish industrial and real estate developers.
Right. These individuals arrived in the United States, and they utilized the American capitalist framework to the absolute maximum. I mean, they opened medical practices, they built tech firms, they acquired vast commercial property portfolios.
They were very successful.
They established massive, rock-solid generational wealth. They were the ultimate beneficiaries of a free market system.
They secured the economic future of their families. But this sociological shift happens with the next generation. The sources focus on their children, who were largely born or raised entirely in the West.
And the environment these children grew up in was completely insulated by luxury.
Yeah.
They didn't have to struggle to establish themselves in a new country. They didn't have to fight for basic economic survival like their parents did. They attended elite universities. They moved in highly educated, affluent circles.
And from that vantage point of extreme privilege, many underwent a significant ideological pivot. They absorbed the academic critiques of structural inequality, and they chose to direct their energy, and crucially their family's capital, into organizing far-left, Marxist-leaning political platforms.
So they are using the generational wealth generated by global capitalist success to fund political operations that explicitly aim to dismantle the very market systems that bought their childhood homes and paid for their elite educations.
That's a phenomenon of elite-funded redistribution. The sources highlight several prominent figures who embody this demographic shift. Like New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani is cited as a prime example of this affluent progressive paradigm.
Yeah, if we look at Mamdani's background, he is the child of globally recognized cultural elites. He was raised in extreme economic privilege in Manhattan.
Right.
He is the literal embodiment of cosmopolitan advantage. Yet, his political rise was fueled by a fiercely democratic socialist platform.
And if you look at the donor networks sustaining these campaigns nationally, the sources note they are increasingly populated by the children of wealthy Arab-American real estate moguls in places like Michigan and affluent Turkish-American corporate elites along the East Coast.
It's like a scenario where the heir to a massive multi-million-dollar nationwide steakhouse empire decides to use their inheritance to fully fund a militant anti-meat political action committee.
That's a perfect analogy.
It is a stunning contradiction, but it brings up a very practical mechanical question.
Okay.
If these highly affluent operators are funding economic theories that are functionally aligned with Marxist redistribution, why do they meticulously avoid ever using the word communist?
That is a great question. They will proudly brand themselves as democratic socialists, but they will go to great lengths to reject the label of communist. And the sources make clear that this is not just a matter of public relations.
Right, it's not just optics.
No, it's not simply about softening their image for moderate suburban voters.
It's about a highly specific piece of federal legislation. It's about avoiding federal prosecution and absolute financial ruin.
Exactly. We're talking about the Communist Control Act of 1954. It is codified in Title 50, U.S. Code Section 842. This is a piece of Cold War-era legislation signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it is still sitting on the books today.
Let's unpack the actual statutory mechanisms of this act, because this isn't just a symbolic resolution saying, we don't like communism. This was a structural legal weapon designed to dismantle organizations.
Oh, it has teeth. The act explicitly states that the Communist Party and, quote, any successors of such party, regardless of the assumed name, unquote, are stripped of all rights, privileges, and immunities attendant upon legal bodies created under the jurisdiction of the United States.
What does that actually mean in practical terms for an organization?
It means total paralysis. Under this federal law, if an entity self-declares as a communist action group, they are legally barred from appearing on state or federal electoral ballots.
Wow, which instantly ends any political ambition. I mean, you can't run for city council if you legally cannot be printed on the ballot.
Exactly. But it goes much further into the basic mechanics of existing in a modern economy. A self-declared communist entity under this act cannot hold a bank account at a federally insured institution.
Wait, really? Try running a modern political action committee without a bank account.
You can't do it.
You cannot process digital donations. You cannot issue payroll to your staff. You cannot buy advertising time. The money simply cannot move.
Furthermore, they are legally barred from signing commercial property leases. You cannot rent a storefront to use as a campaign headquarters. And perhaps most significantly, they cannot seek judicial enforcement of civil contracts.
Let's explain how crippling that last point is, because if you run a political campaign and you pay a vendor $50,000 to print mailers, and that vendor simply takes the money and disappears, you normally take them to court for breach of contract.
But under the 1954 Act, a communist organization has no standing to sue. The courts will not recognize your contract. You essentially become a ghost in the legal and economic system. You're stripped of the basic commercial rights required to function.
Now, obviously, the Red Scare was a long time ago. Has this law actually been enforced recently?
Over the decades, lower courts have chipped away at certain aspects of it, and modern presidential administrations have largely left it unenforced. It is widely considered dormant.
Dormant, but not dead.
Right.
It has never been fully repealed by Congress, and it has never been completely struck down by the Supreme Court. It is still active federal code.
Which completely changes the risk calculus for these wealthy political operators. If you are a progressive organizer sitting on millions of dollars in family assets, or you're managing a massive PAC fund, adopting the label of communist isn't just an edgy ideological statement.
No.
It is a trigger that could activate a hornet's nest of dormant federal code.
A highly motivated state attorney general could potentially use that self-declaration to freeze your bank accounts overnight.
Therefore, the term democratic socialism operates as an incredibly valuable semantic camouflage. It is a palatable, legally compliant mask. It allows these organizations to push for radical wealth redistribution and massive market intervention while entirely shielding their capital from the statutory teeth of that 1954 law.
It is brilliant from a legal and financial defense standpoint. You get to push the policy without risking the capital. But as the sources reveal, a legally sanitized mask might protect your bank accounts, but it cannot hide the massive internal friction that happens when you actually try to govern with this coalition.
Yeah, this is where we move from the theory and the funding into the gritty reality of coalition politics. We have to look at what happens when you try to merge secular progressivism, which heavily champions LGBTQ+ rights and aggressive social liberalism, with orthodox religious frameworks that hold historically conservative views on those exact same social issues.
The sources point to New York City as the primary testing ground for this specific type of ideological collision. Specifically, we are looking at the period during Zohran Mamdani's NYC mayoral administration in early 2026.
And the environment of New York City is crucial context here.
Yeah.
It is famously secular, and it has incredibly robust civil protections for the LGBTQ+ community. Progressive politicians frequently point to NYC as the gold standard for social liberalism.
Right.
They also frequently praise cities like Tel Aviv internationally for similar reasons, as it is widely recognized as a major haven for LGBTQ+ rights in the Middle East.
But the coalition that empowers leaders like Mamdani includes factions that are deeply illiberal on those specific social issues. And that underlying contradiction exploded into public view with a scandal involving Mamdani's wife, Rama Douaji.
Yes. Old social media posts belonging to Douaji surfaced, and the contents were explosive within the context of progressive NYC politics. According to the sources, these posts included the use of explicit anti-gay slurs.
And the sources note she also made explicit geopolitical statements in those same posts, including the phrase, fuck Tel Aviv.
Now, Douaji did issue a public apology, characterizing her past language as harmful. But the political damage to the coalition was structural. It wasn't just a matter of a politician's spouse making a public relations gaffe. It exposed the core contradiction of the entire movement.
Because it forces the voter to ask a fundamental question like, how progressive is a political movement, really, if its leadership quietly harbors or strategically aligns with individuals expressing aggressive anti-gay sentiment?
It exposes the deeply unprogressive latent undercurrents that frequently exist within far-left anti-Zionist coalitions. The sources highlight the cognitive dissonance required to maintain this alliance. You have DSA leaders publicly championing universal queer liberation on one hand, while simultaneously relying on political networks that harbor deep-seated orthodox animosity toward the LGBTQ+ community and secular hubs.
It's an ideological tightrope. You cannot simultaneously be the champion of social progressivism in Manhattan while relying on political infrastructure that uses anti-gay slurs in private. The tension eventually snaps.
It has to.
But as we move from the social friction in New York down to legislative battles in Virginia, we see that this ideological wave is doing more than just causing PR scandals. It is actively attempting to rewrite fundamental constitutional rights.
This is where the focus shifts from social values to hard legislative power, specifically targeting the Second Amendment under the banner of public safety. The sources detail a major legislative battle in Virginia over a comprehensive ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
Let's look at the architects of this legislation to see how the coalition operates in a state house. We have Senate Bill 749.
The author and chief patron of that bill was State Senator Saddam Aslan Salim. He represents a district in Fairfax County. He is a Bangladeshi-American Muslim legislator who is devout in his faith, yet he governs on a highly progressive, secular, democratic platform. He is a direct representative of the political synthesis we have been tracking.
And over in the House of Delegates, the companion bill, House Bill 217, was carried by Delegate Dan Helmer. Ultimately, this comprehensive ban was passed and signed into law by Governor Abigail Spanberger.
So this progressive religious coalition successfully leveraged state power to restrict firearm access. But the backlash to this legislation highlights a profound tension when you view it against the broader domestic security landscape.
Let's explore that tension, because for someone trying to make sense of this legislation, the timing of it feels incredibly discordant. Critics of the bill pointed out the immediate real-world consequences for minority communities.
The argument raised by opponents is that while progressive Muslim legislators were pushing to strip citizens of these specific self-defense tools, Jewish communities across the country, including in Virginia, were facing an unprecedented wave of violent targeting and domestic terror threats.
We will dive into the specific data on those domestic terror threats a bit later, but the immediate legislative consequence is stark. Opponents of the ban argued that by outlawing these specific weapons, the state was actively subverting the ability of vulnerable enclaves, specifically synagogues, to provide adequate armed security for themselves.
It raises a complex question about the practical application of progressive policy. When a progressive coalition prioritizes a blanket ban on certain firearms to achieve a broader vision of public safety, how does that interact with minority groups who feel they rely on those exact tools for community defense in an increasingly hostile environment?
It feels like confiscating the fire extinguishers from a building just as you smell smoke. It's the clash between the progressive ideal of a disarmed, peaceful society and the reality that certain communities feel they require armed security just to safely attend a worship service. But the material consequences of this ideological wave extend beyond self-defense. If we pivot from the East Coast and look at the Midwest, the sources show us how this same political machinery is completely altering the basic economic infrastructure of the working class.
We are talking about municipal housing policy in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. This area has essentially become a primary testing ground for an aggressive implementation of socialist economic theory. And, once again, the sources highlight prominent South Asian politicians heavily aligned with the DSA spearheading these initiatives.
Let's look at the specific individuals driving this policy. In Minneapolis, the sources focus on Aisha Chutai.
She is a Pakistani-American Muslim woman, a very high-profile leader within the Twin Cities Democratic Socialists of America, and she holds a seat on the Minneapolis City Council. She has used that position to aggressively advance strict rent stabilization ordinances.
Let's explain the mechanics of her framework, because she pushed for rent caps strictly tied to inflation, combined with severe vacancy controls. What exactly is a vacancy control?
Well, in a normal rent-controlled environment, a landlord might be capped on how much they can raise the rent on a current tenant. But if that tenant moves out, the landlord can usually reset the rent to market rate for the next person.
Right.
A vacancy control makes that illegal. The rent cap stays attached to the physical apartment, regardless of who lives there or how often it turns over.
If you read traditional Marxist economic theory, this perfectly mirrors the goal of stripping private property owners of their capital gains. It is mathematically designed to slowly remove the profit motive from the concept of housing.
And if we look next door to St. Paul, we see the real-world economic data of what happens when this exact theory is put into practice. The sources highlight Mitra Jalali, a politician of Iranian and Indian descent who was a leading defender of St. Paul's radical 2021 rent control ballot initiative.
And this was not a modest, nuanced regulation. This was a flat 3% annual rent increase cap across the board. And the crucial detail, there were 0 exemptions for new construction. If a developer built a brand new apartment building, they were immediately locked into this strict 3% cap.
Politically, it was celebrated as a massive, historic victory for democratic socialism in the Midwest. But the economic data that followed showed a stark, immediate market reaction.
Let's trace the domino effect for the listener, especially if they are trying to understand how this impacts affordable housing. The day this strict cap went into effect, the revenue models for private landowners effectively broke.
Because if you are managing a property, your costs are not fixed. Your property taxes, your insurance premiums, the cost of labor to fix a roof, the cost of materials, all of these are subject to inflation, which was running significantly higher than 3%.
Right.
But your income was now legally frozen at 3%. Basic building maintenance suddenly became mathematically unviable for many property owners.
But the most significant impact was on new development. According to the Twin Cities Development Index report cited in the sources, residential building permits in St. Paul dropped by over 80%.
An 80% drop is not a minor market correction. It is a complete market freeze.
Explain the mechanism of that capital flight. Why did developers just stop building?
Because real estate development requires massive upfront capital, usually borrowed from banks or institutional investors. Those investors require a projected rate of return to justify the risk of the loan.
Of course.
When St. Paul enacted a 3% cap with absolutely no exemption for new construction, the financial models broke. Investors looked at the math and realized they could not legally turn a profit or service their debt in that city. So the capital simply packed up and fled to other states with viable markets.
Which created a massive artificial housing supply shortage. By attempting to protect current renters from price increases, the policy completely halted the production of new housing, which economists generally agree is the only long-term mechanism to stabilize prices.
Right.
The lack of new housing became so acute that the St. Paul City Council was eventually forced to execute frantic rollbacks of the very law that Jalali and her allies had championed.
It serves as a stark case study of elite-driven socialist policy. Wealthy, ideological organizers dictated market mechanics based on academic theory, but when the capital fled and the housing supply contracted, the consequences were largely borne by the local working class who suddenly couldn't find an available apartment.
So what does this all mean for you? The lesson seems to be that a municipality can pass a law capping rent, but they cannot legally compel a developer to build a building at a financial loss. Capital will always seek a viable return, and if a city outlaws that return, the capital leaves.
So we see the complex outcomes of the secular left's economic policies in the Midwest. But the sources show that their social policies are creating an arguably more disruptive dynamic. The progressive social platforms are actively driving Orthodox religious minorities into strategic alliances with their historical political adversaries.
And nowhere is this dynamic more vivid than what unfolded in Dearborn, Michigan. We are looking at late 2022. The city council chambers and the public school board meetings, specifically centered around Stout Middle School, became highly contested battlegrounds.
The central issue was public library curation. Specifically, the inclusion of LGBTQ plus themed books in the middle school library. The sources mention specific titles like "This Book is Gay" and "All Boys Aren't Blue."
Hundreds of conservative Muslim residents, organized by local religious figures, mobilized to pack these school board meetings and protest the inclusion of these books. The meetings became so chaotic and disorderly that administrators were forced to immediately adjourn them.
Now, protests over library materials occur frequently across the country. But what made the Dearborn situation unique was the unprecedented political alliance that visibly formed in those council chambers.
Yeah, these conservative Muslim residents formed a highly visible tactical alliance with right-wing Christian traditionalists and Michigan GOP leaders who actually traveled to Dearborn to physically join the protests.
It's a phenomenal political realignment.
But hold on, I have to ask a clarifying question here because the history makes this seem impossible. Aren't these right-wing, alt-right factions often the exact same political networks that have spent the last 2 decades pushing anti-Sharia legislation in state houses across the country?
Yes, they are.
The same networks that have historically staged anti-Islam rallies. How do conservative Muslims and Christian nationalists even sit in the same room without it devolving into conflict?
To understand it, the sources require us to look at it strictly as a marriage of convenience. It is a temporary, highly tactical alliance built entirely around a single shared opposition: secular, progressive, social values. If you examine their long-term visions for the country, they remain fundamentally incompatible.
Let's break down those long-term incompatibilities, starting with the exact issue they were protesting: public education. Both groups agreed those specific LGBTQ plus books should be removed, but what do they actually want the curriculum to look like?
Their ultimate goals are completely opposed. The Christian right factions involved in these movements often advocate for preserving and institutionalizing what they define as America's Judeo-Christian heritage within public schools.
Okay.
Historically, these exact groups have fought aggressively against the inclusion of Islamic history, Quranic references, or cultural empathy programs in public education, viewing any accommodation as anti-Christian proselytizing.
Conversely, the Muslim community in Dearborn has spent decades fighting a hard uphill battle for institutionalized recognition in those exact same public schools. They have actively fought for the inclusion of halal school lunch options, the formal observance of Islamic holidays on the academic calendar, and the mandated inclusion of anti-Islamophobia modules in the curriculum.
So you have one faction advocating for a strictly Christian-centric educational environment, and another faction advocating for robust, pluralistic accommodation for Islam. Those two visions cannot structurally coexist in the same classroom over the long term.
And the friction extends far beyond the school boardroom. It gets deeply geopolitical. Many of those same far-right political groups that stood shoulder to shoulder with Dearborn Muslims over library books view Islam itself as an existential threat to Western civilization.
And the Muslim community is acutely aware of that dynamic. They view that Christian nationalist wing as the primary driver of domestic xenophobia and foreign policy hawkishness in the Middle East.
It's a breathtaking dynamic to observe. The Muslim Marxism blueprint tries to build structural bridges based entirely on anti-capitalist economics, and the religious right tries to build bridges based entirely on social morality. But the internal theological and geopolitical divides remain vast.
Massive divides.
They align for a Tuesday night school board meeting to fight a progressive curriculum policy, but their foundational visions for the future of the country are entirely at odds.
Which brings us to the broader, more severe consequence of this extreme polarization and the blurring of political and religious lines. The sources document a profound domestic security crisis that is currently impacting Jewish life in America.
This is where the ideological friction stops being a debate over rent control or library books and becomes an urgent matter of physical safety and the subversion of a community's way of life.
The statistical baselines provided in the sources are grim. Documented data from the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, alongside the FBI's annual Unified Crime Reporting audits, show that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States have reached historic, unprecedented highs.
We need to define the mechanics of these statistics. We are not simply talking about a rise in hateful rhetoric on internet forums. The sources detail a surge in open subversive tactics targeting physical communities and houses of worship.
Synagogues are increasingly being subjected to swatting. For context, swatting is the highly dangerous practice of anonymously calling in fake severe threats, like a hostage situation or a bomb, to draw a massive, heavily armed police response to a specific location.
They are using emergency services as a weapon of terror against a congregation.
Exactly.
The sources also detail extensive extremist graffiti and congregants being subjected to targeted, aggressive intimidation while simply trying to walk into a building to attend worship services.
The physical environment has become so demonstrably hostile that New York Governor Kathy Hochul proposed statewide legislation to create 25-foot mandatory buffer zones around houses of worship, simply to give Jewish congregants physical space and protection from direct intimidation.
This raises a complex question about how this level of hostility is being rationalized by the perpetrators, because the sources indicated is not just coming from traditional right-wing extremist groups. The public opinion polling paints a very different picture.
Yeah, the sources cite extensive data from Harvard-Harris polling and Economist YouGov surveys. This data indicates that younger American demographics, and specifically far-left ideological cohorts, are expressing significantly higher levels of hostility toward Jewish institutions. And the mechanism they use to rationalize this is operating under the banner of anti-Zionism.
This appears to be the crux of the crisis detailed in the sources. There is a deliberate strategic blurring of the line between political dissent regarding international foreign policy and overt religious intolerance domestically.
By framing their hostilities strictly as anti-Zionism, these cohorts are effectively treating local American synagogues and local American Jewish citizens as if they are direct extensions of a foreign military apparatus.
They are using a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles away to justify harassing a family walking into a synagogue in Brooklyn or Los Angeles. It represents a severe erosion of basic civic norms. And it brings us to this ultimate tension we keep seeing repeated throughout all these sources. Where does the right to religious expression end, and where does municipal law and civic integration begin?
That specific tension culminates in a massive legal standoff down in the Texas Sun Belt. This is where all these overlapping themes, Orthodox religious expansion, municipal zoning law, and fundamental constitutional protections collide in a federal courtroom.
Let's look at the mechanics of the standoff. We are looking at the Dallas-Fort Worth suburbs, specifically the towns of Plano and Josephine, Texas. The central entity here is the East Plano Islamic Center, widely known as EPIC. And they were not just applying for a permit to build a standard neighborhood mosque.
The scale is what triggered the conflict. EPIC proposed a massive 402-acre master-planned community. They officially rebranded the project as The Meadow, but locally it was widely referred to as Epic City.
To give the listener some context on the physical scale, 402 acres is a massive footprint for any single private development, let alone a religious organization. A master plan community of that size is essentially building a small town from scratch.
Right.
The plans showed the entire development anchored by a central mosque, surrounded by an Islamic school, massive designated residential zones, and dedicated commercial enclaves.
It was envisioned as a highly self-contained, religiously oriented community. And the backlash from local suburban residents, which quickly escalated to state officials, was immediate and fierce.
Neighbors and critics looked at the sheer scale of the blueprint and alleged that the developers were not simply building a standard residential subdivision. They alleged that EPIC was attempting to establish an insular, self-governing religious enclave rooted in Sharia principles.
The core of the critics' legal argument relied on the Texas Fair Housing Act. They argued that a massive community built so explicitly around Orthodox religious infrastructure would inherently, structurally discriminate against Christian, Jewish, or secular homebuyers who might want to purchase property in that area.
The political reaction at the state level was sweeping. Governor Greg Abbott and U.S. Senator John Cornyn launched massive state probes into the project. They directed multiple state agencies to aggressively investigate EPIC's consumer compliance records, their land zoning applications, and their financial structures.
The state pressure escalated to the point where the Texas Funeral Service Commission actually issued a formal cease and desist order against EPIC, specifically targeting their traditional Islamic funeral practices. The state essentially brought the full weight of its regulatory apparatus down on the development.
But the state ultimately lost in federal court.
They did. In June 2026, a federal judge handed down a decisive ruling in the case of East Plano Islamic Center versus Texas Funeral Service Commission.
Let's break down the mechanics of the judge's ruling. The court determined that the Texas Funeral Service Commission had drastically overstepped its regulatory authority. The judge ruled that the state's actions violated EPIC's First Amendment rights to the free exercise of religion, as well as their constitutional rights to equal protection under the law.
Furthermore, and this is a crucial point regarding the allegations of a paralegal enclave, the court explicitly noted that despite all the political rhetoric and the sweeping state probes, there was zero evidentiary proof that the organization was attempting to subvert local municipal law.
The court found they were simply utilizing existing zoning and real estate laws to build a massive religious community entirely within the bounds of the U.S. Constitution.
Exactly.
It is a major legal victory for APIC, but as we zoom out and look at this entire deep dive, it highlights a profound reality. Whether we are analyzing housing policy in the Midwest, school board curriculum in Dearborn, or massive land zoning in Texas, the intersection of orthodox religious expansion and constitutional protections is the ultimate modern American flashpoint.
We are witnessing a complete, real-time reshuffling of traditional political alliances. We see wealthy capitalist heirs funding socialist machinery, devout Muslim demographics allying with secular Marxists on economics, and then pivoting to ally with right-wing Christian nationalists on social issues. It is a landscape defined entirely by tactical paradox.
It is a massive web to untangle. So let's briefly recap the mechanics of the journey we've taken today. We started by tracing the historical synthesis of Muslim Marxism in the early 20th century, exploring how figures like Sultan Ghaliev proposed weaponizing religious cohesion against Western imperialism, and how that blueprint evolved through movements like the MEK and Arab socialism.
We then explored the sociological paradox driving the modern movement, detailing how the affluent, insulated children of highly successful capitalist immigrants spanning South Asian, Arab, and Turkish diasporas are utilizing their inherited wealth to structurally fund democratic socialist platforms in America.
We unpacked the specific semantic camouflage they utilize, hiding behind the term democratic socialist, to shield their massive capital and operational infrastructure from the devastating legal and financial penalties of the 1954 Communist Control Act. We looked at the intense ideological collisions this creates, from Rama Duwaji's anti-gay social media scandal exposing the friction within progressive New York City, to Senator Salim's push for a gun ban in Virginia amid rising security fears in minority communities.
We analyzed the stark market reaction to Marxist-inspired rent caps in the Twin Cities, championed by DSA leaders like Aisha Chutai and Mitra Jawali, explaining how the 3% cap and vacancy controls cost capital flight and decimated the local housing supply. We then examined the fractured right-wing alliances in Dearborn over library books, highlighting the irreconcilable, long-term differences over public education and domestic xenophobia.
And finally, we tracked the profound domestic security crisis marked by soaring anti-Semitism and swatting, culminating in the massive, federally litigated zoning wars over the 402-acre EPIC city development in the Texas Sunbelt.
It is a vast, deeply interconnected map of wealth, ideology, and constitutional friction.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, our listener. Something to mull over and explore on your own as you watch these policies play out. We talked extensively about the mechanics of the Communist Control Act of 1954 and how it is currently dormant, allowing these massively wealthy, progressive socialist networks to accumulate capital, run PACs, and acquire municipal power while using the democratic socialist shield.
The law remains codified in Title 50 U.S. Code, Section 842, but it hasn't been aggressively tested by modern administrations.
But consider the sheer volume of wealth and political influence we've discussed today. What happens if the political winds shift at the state level? What happens if a highly motivated conservative state attorney general decides to dust off that 70-year-old Cold War-era law and test it in a modern Supreme Court against a high-profile, extremely wealthy DSA-affiliated PAC?
If a modern court were to uphold the statute and apply it, the structural implications would be immense.
Could the very multi-million-dollar capitalist wealth they inherited, the money structurally funding this entire movement, become instantly frozen by a law signed by Dwight Eisenhower? It's a legal time bomb sitting quietly in the federal code, just waiting for the right spark to test the boundaries of modern political finance.
It is a mechanical legal question that could very well define the next decade of American political organizing.
We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Navigating these complex, overlapping layers of religion, wealth, historical theory, and modern policy isn't easy, but understanding these underlying mechanics is crucial to making sense of where American civic life is heading. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking at the data, and keep exploring the mechanics of the world around you. Until next time.